The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the station itself was screaming, a long metallic groan that shook dust from the ceiling panels above my console. I grabbed the edge of my desk and looked at the wall display, where a wave of red dots was swallowing a green cluster near the edge of Kryn space. 40 ships, then 30, then 19. The numbers were falling faster than I could read them. I am Talon Osari, communications officer of the Coalition relay station Verith, and I had never seen a battle collapse this fast. The Kryn Assembly, one of the oldest and most disciplined fleets in the galaxy, was being erased in real time by something the sensors could barely classify. Not a fleet, not an army, a swarm. Millions of small, coordinated units moving as one mind, tearing through shields like they were made of paper. My supervisor, a tall Doran officer named Vashek, stood behind me with his hands pressed against the console, his 4 eyes locked on the display. "Send the distress call," he said. "Full priority. Every allied world, now." I did not need to be told twice. My fingers moved across the panel, and within seconds the message was flying out to every corner of Coalition space. A call for help stamped with the highest urgency code we had. It went to the Doran cluster, the Ashvar colonies, the Vothi Compact, and almost as an afterthought, to the newest member of our alliance, a species barely 3 years into full Coalition status. Earth. I remember thinking as I sent that last copy that it barely mattered. Humans were new, untested, curious, yes, clever in trade negotiations, quick to adapt, but no one expected them to matter in a crisis like this. Their fleet was small. Their colonies were young. I sent the message to them out of protocol, not hope. Then something happened that I still cannot fully explain, even now, telling this story long after it ended. The response came back in under 4 minutes. Every other species took hours to reply, some of them a full day, weighing the risk, calling councils, debating whether the Kryn Assembly was worth the cost of their ships. That is normal. That is expected. War is expensive, and no government spends lives without a meeting first. Not the humans. Their answer appeared on my screen as a short, clean line of text, routed through the Terran Defense Authority with no preamble, no diplomatic softening, nothing but the words themselves. "Which unit type do you require?" I read it twice, because I thought I had misunderstood the translation. I looked up at Vashek, expecting him to laugh it off, to say it was a glitch or a joke. Instead, his 4 eyes had gone very still, and the color had drained from the ridges along his neck. "They are not asking if they will help," he said quietly. "They are asking what kind of help we need." I did not understand why that mattered so much to him. To me it sounded efficient, even reassuring. A species that did not waste time on debate, while our people were dying, seemed like exactly what we needed. I said as much, and Vashek turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, something between respect and unease. "You have not served with them," he said. "I have. There is a difference between the humans who fly supply ships and negotiate trade routes, and the humans who answer a question like that in 4 minutes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. When a request comes in fast and clean like this, it does not go to their regular forces, it goes somewhere else first. A list most of us are never shown. I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and told me to route the reply to command and let them decide. I did as he asked, but the unease in his voice stayed with me the rest of that shift, a small cold thread running under everything else, and I found myself glancing at the message again and again, as if staring at it long enough might explain what he was afraid of. 2 hours later, command's decision came through, and I was the one who had to send the confirmation back to Terran Defense Authority. The order was simple. We needed a rapid strike force capable of breaking a coordinated hive intelligence, something with speed, adaptability, and enough force to punch through swarm formations before the Kryn homeworld fell. I typed the request exactly as command dictated it, word for word, and sent it across the relay. The reply that came back this time took even less time than the first, less than 90 seconds. Acknowledged. Preparing deployment. No questions about resources. No requests for additional intelligence. No demand for compensation or political concessions. The kind of thing every other species always asks for before committing forces to someone else's war. Just 2 short sentences and a transport schedule that followed less than a minute later, listing arrival times calculated down to the second. I sat back in my chair and felt something strange settle over me, a mixture of relief and a small nagging discomfort I could not name. Around the station, word of the human response was already spreading. I could hear it in the corridors outside the comms bay, voices lowering, footsteps slowing near doorways where officers gathered to talk. A young HFY technician stopped by my station on her way to the mess hall and asked, with wide, nervous eyes, whether it was true that the humans had already launched ships. "They have," I told her, "faster than anyone else." She did not look relieved. She looked worried, and when I asked her why, she only shrugged and said her uncle had served alongside a human unit once, years ago, during a border conflict nobody talked about anymore. She said he came back different, quieter. He would not tell her what happened, only that the humans who were sent were not like the ones you saw in trade markets or diplomatic halls. I filed that comment away in the back of my mind, the same way I filed away Vashek's reaction, small, strange pieces of a picture I did not yet understand. At the time, I told myself it was nothing more than old war stories, the kind every species collects and exaggerates over the years. Humans were relatively new to galactic society. Surely whatever reputation they carried from a handful of early skirmishes was overblown, shaped more by unfamiliarity than by anything real. I was wrong about that, but I would not learn how wrong until much later. For the rest of that shift, I monitored the battle at the Kryn front, watching the red tide continue to spread despite everything the assembly threw at it. Their ships fought with everything they had, and still the swarm advanced, absorbing losses that would have broken any conventional force, adapting to every tactic thrown against it within minutes. It was like watching a fire spread through dry grass, and every bucket of water we poured on it only seemed to make it burn brighter somewhere else. Vashek stayed at his post long past the end of his shift, watching the display with an intensity I rarely saw in him. At one point he leaned over my shoulder and pointed to a section of the star map, a quiet stretch of space just outside Kryn territory. "That is where they will stage," he said. "Watch that sector." I asked how he knew, and he told me he had seen this pattern before, years ago, on a world whose name he refused to say out loud. He said the humans never announced their approach. They arrived, positioned themselves exactly where they needed to be, and waited for the order, all without a single unnecessary transmission. Sure enough, less than 6 hours after the confirmation message, sensor readings picked up a cluster of unregistered signals entering the staging sector Vashek had pointed to. No fanfare, no formal announcement to the fleet command network, just a quiet, precise arrival that would have gone unnoticed if we had not been watching for it. I remember staring at those signals on my screen, small and unremarkable compared to the massive Kryn battle fleet burning across the same display, and thinking that this could not possibly be enough to matter. A handful of ships, arriving without ceremony, against a swarm that had already devoured a third of the strongest fleet in this region of space. Vashek did not share my doubt. He stood very still, watching the signals with an expression I can only describe as grim anticipation, the look of someone who has seen a storm gather before and knows exactly what is coming, even if he cannot say it out loud. "They did not send their soldiers," he said finally, almost to himself. "Not yet." I asked him what that meant, what the difference could possibly be between one kind of human fighter and another. He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached over and pulled up a personnel request that had come through with the deployment, a manifest listing the incoming unit designations, all of it flagged for restricted clearance far above my own. He looked at it for a long moment, his 4 eyes narrowing, and then he said something that stayed with me long after that shift ended, something that turned the quiet unease in my chest into something closer to real fear. This request, he said, tapping the screen, was not sent to their army. It was sent somewhere else, somewhere they do not talk about, even to their own allies. I asked him what that somewhere was, and for the first time since I had known him, Vashek did not have an answer ready. He only shook his head slowly, staring at the staging sector where those quiet, unremarkable ships continued to wait in the dark, patient and silent for whatever order was coming next. Neither of us knew yet what that order would unleash. But standing there in the low hum of the comms bay, watching those small dots hold their position against the growing red tide, I understood for the first time that the galaxy had asked humanity for help, and humanity had not sent what anyone expected. They had sent something else entirely, and we were about to find out exactly what that meant. My clearance was raised without warning the next morning, a message waiting for me the moment I logged into my console. Command wanted a liaison assigned to coordinate directly with the incoming Terran unit, someone who understood both fleet protocol and basic human communication patterns. Vashek recommended me before I even had a chance to volunteer, and by midday I found myself standing in a briefing room I had never been allowed into before, staring at a personnel file that made less and less sense the longer I read it. The document in front of me was supposed to be a standard unit roster, the kind I had processed dozens of times for other Allied deployments. Instead, it looked like something had been taken apart and reassembled, with half the pieces missing. Names were listed without service branches. Ranks did not match any structure I recognized. Several entries simply read "voluntary reactivation," with no further explanation, as if that phrase alone was supposed to answer every question I might have. I called up the profile of the unit commander first, expecting the usual mix of training history, campaign records, and command evaluations. What I found instead was mostly blank space. A name, Nora Callahan, an age listed as 34, a single line under prior service that had been redacted so thoroughly it looked like a black bar stretching across the screen. No campaign history, no commendations, no photographs from official ceremonies, the kind every other Allied officer's file was full of. I sat with that file for a long time, trying to piece together what kind of soldier could exist with almost no visible record at all, especially from a species as young to galactic society as humanity. Every other human file I had seen before this, from trade delegations to border patrol units, was thorough almost to the point of excess, filled with certifications and evaluations and personal statements. This one felt like the opposite. Deliberately hollow, deliberately quiet. An old Vothi quartermaster named Cyril Athana was assigned to help me prepare the arrival logistics, and when I showed her the file, expecting her to help me make sense of it, she went very still. I watched the color drain from the ridges along her jaw the same way it had drained from Vashek's the day before, and for a moment she did not say anything at all. "Where did this list come from?" she finally asked, her voice lower than before. I told her it came through the standard Terran Defense Authority channel, flagged with the deployment confirmation. She shook her head slowly, scrolling through the names one by one, her expression growing more troubled with each entry. "I served alongside humans once," she said. 10 years ago, during the border conflict at the Halvan Reach, I worked logistics for a joint operation, moving supplies for their regular forces. Good soldiers, disciplined, professional. They followed orders, filed reports, celebrated victories with the rest of us. She paused, tapping one clawed finger against the screen. "This is not that. These designations, the way the records are sealed, the way there is no campaign history attached to any of them. I have only seen a roster like this once before." I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated before answering, as if deciding whether the story was even hers to tell. "There was an incident at a coalition outpost near the edge of contested space," she said. "A raiding force had taken hostages, dozens of Allied personnel, and the negotiations were going nowhere. The situation was already 3 days old when a small human team arrived, 6 people, no more. They did not coordinate with the standing coalition command structure the way regular units do. They did not wait for authorization to move. They went in alone, at night, and by morning the hostages were free and the raiding force was gone. She looked up at me. Gone. Not captured, not surrendered, gone. No one who worked that outpost ever spoke about what happened inside those 3 hours, not even years later, and the 6 who did it were never mentioned in any official record afterward. It was as if they had never been there at all. I felt a chill settle over me as she spoke, the same cold thread of unease I had felt the day before in the comms bay, growing sharper now with every word. I asked her if she thought the current unit, the one heading to the Kryn front, was the same kind of team. She looked back down at the file, at the name Nora Callahan sitting above that long black bar of redacted history, and she nodded slowly. I think, she said, the humans did not send us soldiers. I think they sent us the people soldiers go quiet around. Those words settled into my chest and stayed there for the rest of the day, following me through every task I completed in preparation for the unit's arrival. I coordinated docking clearance, arranged translation protocols, prepared briefing materials on the current state of the Kryn front, and through all of it, Cyril's description kept repeating in my mind. The people soldiers go quiet around. I did not fully understand what that meant yet, but I understood enough to feel that whatever was arriving on our station in a matter of hours was not going to fit neatly into anything I had experienced before. Vashek found me later that afternoon in the observation deck, staring out at the docking bay where the human transport was scheduled to arrive. He stood beside me quietly for a while before speaking, his 4 eyes fixed on the dark starfield outside the viewport. "You have been reading the file," he said. It was not a question. I admitted that I had, and that Cyril had told me about the incident at the border outpost. He nodded slowly, unsurprised, as if he had expected the story to reach me eventually. "There is something you should understand before they arrive," he said. "Humanity keeps 2 very different kinds of soldiers. The first kind you have already met, in trade convoys and diplomatic escorts, and the border patrols along contested territory. They are professional, capable, and entirely ordinary by galactic standards. They fight when ordered, they follow rules of engagement, they go home when the mission ends, and they live full lives afterward." He paused, and I could see him choosing his next words with care, the same careful hesitation Cyril had shown earlier. "The second kind," he continued, "is what you are about to meet. They do not appear in ceremonies. They do not appear in recruitment records that anyone outside their own government is permitted to see. When Earth activates them, it is because every ordinary option has already failed, or because the situation requires something their regular forces are not equipped, or perhaps not willing, to do." I asked him directly what that meant, tired of the careful phrasing both he and Cyril kept using instead of a straight answer. Vashek was quiet for a long moment before he finally spoke. "It means the swarm currently destroying the Kryn assembly has never faced anything like what is about to arrive," he said, "and it means that when this is over, you may understand exactly why the rest of the galaxy speaks so carefully around humans who carry files like the one you were given today." Before I could press him further, an alert chimed across the observation deck, signaling an incoming vessel on final approach. I turned toward the viewport just in time to see it emerge from the dark, a single transport ship, unlike any human vessel I had seen documented in Coalition records. It was not large, it was not heavily armed, at least not visibly. It moved with a kind of quiet, deliberate precision, adjusting its approach vector with minimal corrections, as if the pilot had made this exact maneuver 1,000 times before and felt nothing at all doing it again. The ship docked without a single wasted motion, the airlock sealing with a soft hiss that seemed unreasonably calm, given everything Cyril and Vashek had just told me. I stood at the viewing window above the docking bay, watching the seal indicator shift from red to green, my hands unconsciously tightening around the railing in front of me. Vashek stood beside me, silent now, watching the same indicator with an expression I could not fully read. Somewhere behind us, Cyril arrived to observe as well, along with a handful of other officers who had heard whispers about the unusual deployment and wanted to see for themselves what all the quiet unease was about. The airlock door slid open. For a moment, nothing happened. No one emerged. The corridor beyond the door remained dark and still, and I found myself holding my breath, unsure of what I expected to see, and suddenly very aware of how loudly my own heartbeat sounded in my ears. Then a figure stepped through the doorway into the light, and the room around me seemed to go completely silent. She was not what I expected. There was no imposing armor, no elaborate insignia, no dramatic entrance befitting the stories I had just been told. She wore simple tactical gear, practical and worn in a way that suggested long use rather than ceremony. Her dark hair pulled back tightly, her expression calm, in a way that felt almost unsettling given the weight of everything I now knew about the file bearing her name. Nora Callahan stepped fully into the docking bay, followed by a small group of soldiers moving with the same quiet, economical precision as the ship that had carried them here. No greetings were exchanged among them, no commands were shouted. They simply moved, each person seeming to already know exactly where they needed to be and what needed to happen next, as if the entire arrival had been rehearsed 100 times before, or as if none of it required rehearsal at all because it had simply become instinct. I stepped forward to greet her, remembering my assignment as liaison, and extended a formal welcome according to Coalition protocol. She listened politely, her eyes steady and unreadable, and when I finished, she gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Then she asked a single question, her voice calm and direct, cutting straight past every formality I had prepared. "How deep is the queen nest?" I blinked, momentarily thrown by the question, before recovering enough to explain that our sensors had not yet confirmed the exact depth of the swarm's central intelligence structure, only its approximate location within the contested sector. She listened without interrupting, absorbing the information with the same stillness Sorel had described from years before, and when I finished speaking, she simply nodded once and turned to her unit. "We move in 6 hours," she said. No further explanation. No requests for additional briefings. No demands for logistical support beyond what had already been arranged. She walked past me toward the tactical staging area our engineers had prepared, her team following in the same silent formation, and I was left standing in the docking bay beside Vashik and Sorel, all three of us watching them go. "That is all," I said quietly, half to myself. No questions about strategy, no requests for reinforcements. Cyril shook her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the corridor, where the humans had disappeared. "They already have a strategy," she said. "They decided it before they ever left their homeworld. Everything since then has simply been the details." I did not fully understand what she meant, not yet, but standing there in the quiet aftermath of that arrival, watching the docking bay slowly return to its normal activity around us, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever these people were, whatever the galaxy whispered about them in careful, half-finished sentences, I was about to see it for myself, and some part of me, deep down, was no longer certain I wanted to. 6 hours passed faster than I expected, and I spent every minute of them trying to learn as much as I could about the swarm we were about to face, hoping that understanding the enemy might help settle the unease that had been building in my chest since the moment Nora Callahan stepped off that transport. What I found in the sensor logs only made things worse. The swarm operated as a single distributed mind, thousands of individual units, linked by a signal network so dense and so fast that no coalition countermeasure had managed to disrupt it for more than a few seconds at a time. Every tactic the Kryn assembly attempted, the swarm adapted to within minutes, sometimes faster. It learned. It anticipated. It had already broken 3 separate defensive lines using methods that should not have worked twice against the same enemy, and yet each time it succeeded again, refining itself a little further with every engagement. I brought these concerns to Nora directly, catching her in the staging area where her unit was preparing equipment I did not recognize, sleek, dark cases that none of them bothered to explain as they worked. She listened to my summary of the swarm's adaptive capabilities without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when I finished, she asked only one follow-up question. How fast does it learn from a single engagement? I told her our best estimate, based on the pattern of the last 3 battles, was somewhere between 4 and 7 minutes before the swarm began adjusting its formations in response to whatever tactic had just been used against it. She nodded slowly, filing the number away without any visible reaction, and returned to her preparations. I asked her, somewhat desperately, whether her unit had a plan capable of accounting for an enemy that adapted that quickly. She looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time since her arrival, and something in her expression softened just slightly, enough that I felt, for a strange moment, that she understood exactly how frightened I was, even if I had not said it out loud. "We are not going to give it enough time to adapt," she said simply. "You cannot learn from a pattern you never see twice." I did not fully understand what she meant until hours later, when I watched from the command bunker as her unit deployed onto the surface of a small moon near the edge of Kryn territory, one of several forward positions the swarm had begun using to stage its assaults deeper into assembly space. The bunker was crowded that night, filled with coalition officers from a dozen different species, all of us gathered around the same tactical display, watching 6 human soldiers walk toward an enemy that had already destroyed fleets 100 times their size. I remember thinking, in that moment, that it looked almost absurd. 6 figures against an entrenched swarm position holding thousands of units. I glanced at Vashek beside me, hoping to see some sign of reassurance in his expression, but he was watching the display with the same tense stillness as everyone else in the room, his 4 eyes fixed on the small human formation as it approached the tree line at the edge of the swarm's perimeter. The first contact came almost immediately, a burst of activity along the swarm's outer sensors as it detected the incoming unit and began mobilizing a response. On the display, hundreds of small red markers surged toward the 6 human dots, a wave that should have overwhelmed them within seconds by any conventional measure of force ratios. It did not happen the way I expected. Instead of retreating or attempting to hold a defensive line, the human unit split apart, each soldier moving independently in a pattern that looked chaotic at first glance but revealed itself, within moments, to be anything but random. They moved through gaps in the swarm's advance that should not have existed, striking at specific points along its formation, with a precision that suggested they had already mapped out weaknesses in a structure our own analysts had spent weeks failing to identify. Cyril, standing near the back of the bunker, let out a low breath I barely heard over the murmur of the room. "They are not fighting the swarm," she said quietly. "They are dismantling it." I watched, transfixed, as the tactical display updated in real time, the swarm's coordinated response beginning to fracture almost as quickly as it had formed. Nora's unit was not trying to destroy the enemy through sheer force, the way every coalition strategy so far had attempted. They were targeting the connective nodes of the swarm's communication network, the small relay points that allowed thousands of individual units to think and move as one, cutting the hive mind apart piece by piece before it had a chance to fully organize against them. It should not have worked. According to every briefing I had read that day, the swarm's network was too dense, too redundant, to be disrupted by a handful of ground units without heavy artillery support. And yet, on the display in front of me, sections of the swarm's formation were beginning to fragment, smaller clusters losing coordination with the larger whole, some units simply stopping in place, disconnected and directionless, as the network holding them together came apart around them. An Ashvar tactical officer standing near the main console turned to Vashek with a look of open disbelief. "This is not standard doctrine," he said. "There is no coalition strategy that accounts for disabling a hive network from the ground like this." Vashek did not look away from the display. "It is not coalition doctrine," he said quietly. "It is theirs." The engagement continued for nearly 3 hours, and I watched every minute of it, unable to look away even as my body grew stiff from standing so long in the crowded bunker. The swarm attempted to adapt, just as our reports had predicted it would, shifting its formations and rerouting its network connections in an effort to close the gaps Nora's unit kept exploiting. But every time it adjusted, the humans had already moved on to a new target, striking at a different weak point before the swarm could fully compensate for the last one. Cyril's earlier words came back to me then, the ones about a pattern you never see twice, and I finally understood what Nora had meant. At one point during the engagement, the display flagged a warning I did not immediately understand, a spike in unusual energy readings near the center of the swarm's forward position. I asked the tactical officer nearest me what it meant, and he explained, his voice tight with concentration, that the swarm appeared to be attempting to consolidate its remaining units into a single defensive cluster, a last resort formation typically used only when a hive mind determined it could no longer win through conventional dispersal. "It is trying to retreat," he said, sounding almost disbelieving as he said it. I looked back at the display, at the small human formation still moving through the wreckage of the swarm's shattered network, and felt something shift inside my chest, a mixture of awe and a deep, unsettling discomfort that I could not fully separate from each other. This was not how battles against the swarm were supposed to go. Every previous engagement had ended in coalition losses, sometimes catastrophic ones, the swarm's adaptive intelligence proving too fast and too relentless for any conventional force to overcome. And yet here, in the span of a few hours, 6 human soldiers had done what entire fleets could not. Vashek finally spoke again, his voice low, meant only for me. "I told you they do not fight like soldiers following orders," he said. "They fight like people who already know how the battle ends, and are simply working through the steps required to get there." I did not respond, because I did not know how to respond. I only watched, along with everyone else in that crowded bunker, as the swarm's forward position collapsed entirely, its remaining units scattering in directions that no longer made coordinated sense, the hive mind's control over them severed beyond any ability to reassert itself in time to matter. By the time the engagement ended, the swarm's presence on that moon had been reduced from a threat capable of overwhelming a coalition battle group to a scattered handful of disconnected units, easily contained by the support forces that moved in afterward to secure the position. Nora's unit did not celebrate. I watched them regroup on the tactical display, exchange a few brief words I could not hear, and begin moving toward the extraction point with the same quiet efficiency they had shown from the moment they arrived. I left the command bunker that night with my mind full of questions I was not sure I wanted answered. I had come into this assignment believing, on some level, that Vashek and Cyril's careful warnings were exaggerations, old stories inflated by time and unfamiliarity into something more frightening than the truth. Standing in that bunker, watching 6 human soldiers dismantle a threat that had broken 3 coalition fleets, I no longer believed that. Cyril found me in the corridor outside the bunker, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful now, though the unease from earlier had not entirely left her eyes. "You understand now," she said, "why the rest of the galaxy is careful with what it asks of them." I told her I was beginning to, though a part of me still struggled to reconcile the calm, quiet woman who had asked me a single tactical question in the docking bay with the tactical precision I had just witnessed on the display. Cyril nodded slowly, as if she had expected exactly that response. "This was only the first position," she said. "The swarm still holds the deeper structures near the Kryn homeworld. What you saw tonight was 6 soldiers clearing an outpost." She paused, glancing back toward the bunker where the tactical display still glowed faintly through the doorway. "Tomorrow we find out what happens when they go after the source." I did not sleep well that night, my mind replaying the engagement over and over, the strange calm efficiency of it, the way the swarm's overwhelming intelligence had simply come apart under a kind of pressure it had never been designed to withstand. Somewhere on the station above me, I knew, Nora Callahan and her unit were already preparing for whatever came next, and for the first time since this assignment began, I found myself hoping, quietly and fervently, that I would never have to see them turn that same calm precision toward anything I cared about. But I also understood, lying awake in the dim light of my quarters, that the swarm devouring the Kryn assembly had no idea what it had just provoked. It had learned to adapt to fear, to overwhelming force, to desperation. It had never learned to adapt to something that felt no fear at all, that moved through its collapse with the same unhurried calm it might show walking through an empty corridor. Whatever was coming next, I understood now, the swarm was not ready for it. None of us were. The next morning brought a briefing I had not expected to attend, a summons from command requesting my presence in the main tactical center rather than the smaller bunker I had grown used to. When I arrived, I found the room already full, senior officers from across the coalition gathered around a central display showing the full scope of the swarm's remaining territory near the Kryn homeworld. Vashek stood near the front, and he waved me over to stand beside him as the briefing began. The scale of what remained was sobering. The outpost Nora's unit had cleared the night before represented only a small fraction of the swarm's total presence in the region. The bulk of its forces, along with what our analysts believed to be the central intelligence structure controlling the entire hive, was concentrated in a fortified position deep within what had once been Kryn agricultural territory, now transformed into something unrecognizable, dense structures grown from material the swarm had harvested from the land itself. A Kryn officer, one of the few survivors from the original defensive fleet, addressed the room with a voice still hoarse from days of continuous combat. She explained that 3 separate attempts to strike at the central structure had already failed, each one costing more ships and more lives than the last, the swarm's defenses growing more coordinated with every attempt as it learned from each failed assault. "We no longer have the fleet strength for a 4th attempt," she said, her voice tight with something between exhaustion and quiet desperation. "Whatever happens next will determine whether the Assembly survives this war at all." I glanced toward the back of the room and saw Nora standing near the doorway, her expression as calm and unreadable as it had been since her arrival, listening to the briefing without any visible reaction to the weight of what was being described. When the Kryn officer finished speaking, all eyes in the room turned toward her, waiting for some response, some indication of how her small unit intended to succeed where entire fleets had failed. She stepped forward, studying the display for a long moment before speaking. "How many defensive layers?" she asked. The Kryn officer pulled up a more detailed scan of the central structure, revealing a series of concentric barriers surrounding what appeared to be the swarm's core, each layer more heavily defended than the last. Nora studied the image in silence, her eyes moving methodically across each section, and I found myself watching her rather than the display, trying to read something, anything, in her expression that might explain the confidence Vashek and Cyril had described. "The outer layers exist to protect the response time of the inner ones," she said finally, more to herself than to the room. "If we move fast enough, the inner layers will not have time to reinforce before we reach the core." An older Doran strategist, near the front of the room, shook his head, his voice sharp with disbelief. "That structure spans nearly 40 kilometers. No ground force could cross that distance before the swarm mobilizes a full defensive response." Nora did not argue with him. She simply turned back to the display and said, "We are not planning to cross it on the ground." What followed was a briefing unlike anything I had witnessed before. Nora and the rest of her unit outlining a plan that seemed, at every stage, to defy the tactical logic every other officer in that room had spent their careers learning. They intended to insert directly into the innermost layer, using a method that bypassed the outer defenses entirely, relying on the swarm's own adaptive intelligence working against it, exploiting the fact that a system built to anticipate gradual, escalating threats struggled to process something that arrived without warning at its most vulnerable point. I did not understand every detail of the plan, much of it delivered in clipped, technical language I was not cleared to fully interpret, but I understood enough to recognize that it was audacious in a way that made even the Kryn officer, a veteran of years of warfare against this very enemy, visibly uncertain. "And if it fails?" she asked quietly. Nora looked at her, and for the first time since I had met her, something like genuine sympathy crossed her expression. "It will not fail," she said, "but if you are asking what happens to us if it does, that is not something you need to plan around." Prepare your remaining forces to secure the perimeter once the core intelligence is disabled. That is the only outcome you need to be ready for." The room was quiet after that, the weight of her certainty settling over everyone present in a way that felt strange, almost uncomfortable, given everything at stake. I glanced at Vashek and saw him watching Nora with an expression I recognized now, the same grim respect he had shown from the very beginning of this assignment, the look of someone who had seen this kind of confidence before and knew, from experience, that it was rarely misplaced. The operation began less than 12 hours later, and this time I was permitted to observe from the command bunker alongside the senior officers, watching the tactical display with a knot of tension in my chest that had not eased since the briefing. Nora's unit moved into position under cover of a coordinated sensor disruption provided by the remaining Kryn fleet, a diversion intended to draw the swarm's attention toward the outer perimeter while the true insertion happened elsewhere. For the first hour, everything proceeded in tense, careful silence, the human unit advancing through gaps in the swarm's outer layers with the same precise efficiency I had witnessed the night before. But as they approached the second defensive ring, the swarm's response began to intensify in a way our analysts had not fully anticipated, the hive mind redirecting resources faster than expected, as if some deeper instinct within its collective intelligence had recognized the danger before the outer sensors had fully processed it. I watched the tactical display show wave after wave of swarm units converging on the human position, far more than the diversion should have allowed to break away from the outer perimeter. The Kryn officer beside me tensed visibly, her hands gripping the edge of the console as she watched the numbers climb. "They are adapting faster than the model predicted," she said, her voice strained. "If the second ring closes before the extraction window, they will be trapped inside with no support." I looked toward the back of the room, half expecting to see some sign of panic among the officers coordinating the operation, but found only focused concentration instead, a kind of controlled urgency that felt entirely different from fear. On the display, I watched the human unit's markers shift formation again, splitting apart just as they had during the outpost engagement, each figure moving independently through the tightening swarm response with a precision that made my chest ache with something I could not quite name. Part terror, part awe. The swarm closed the second ring behind them within minutes, cutting off any conventional path of retreat, and for a long, terrible stretch of time, the tactical display showed 6 human markers deep inside a structure, now completely surrounded by an enemy that had adapted, evolved, and mobilized every resource it had left in a desperate effort to eliminate the threat at its core. I do not know how to fully describe what happened over the next 90 minutes, watching that display, because so much of it defied the tactical understanding I had built over years of coalition service. The human unit did not attempt to fight their way back out through the closing ring. Instead, they continued forward, deeper into the structure, moving with a speed and precision that suggested every step had already been calculated, every obstacle already anticipated long before it appeared. At one point, the display flagged a massive spike in the swarm's central network activity, a surge of coordinated energy that our analysts initially feared was some kind of final defensive measure, a last effort by the hive mind to protect its core intelligence at any cost. The Kryn officer beside me went pale, watching the numbers climb toward levels none of our previous engagements had ever recorded. Then, just as suddenly as it had spiked, the activity collapsed entirely. The display went eerily quiet, hundreds of swarm markers across the entire region simply stopping in place, their coordinated movement replaced by scattered, directionless drifting, the same disconnection I had seen on a smaller scale during the outpost engagement, now happening across the swarm's entire remaining territory all at once. A long, stunned silence fell over the command bunker as everyone present processed what they were seeing. The Kryn officer beside me let out a shaking breath, her hand pressed against her chest, and somewhere behind me I heard Sorel's voice, quiet with disbelief. "The core is gone," she said. "They reached it." Confirmation came a few minutes later, a short, clipped transmission from Nora's unit, reporting the central intelligence structure disabled, along with a request for extraction support at the coordinates they had already secured. There was no triumph in her voice when the message came through, no relief, nothing beyond the same calm, efficient tone she had used since the moment I first met her in the docking bay. The room erupted into activity after that, officers moving quickly to coordinate the extraction and begin securing the swarm's scattered remnants before they could regroup, but I found myself standing still for a long moment, staring at the display where the swarm's once overwhelming presence had been reduced, in the span of a single operation, to nothing more than scattered, harmless fragments. Vashek stood beside me, watching the same display with an expression that mixed relief with something heavier, something I was only beginning to understand myself. "Now you have seen it," he said quietly. "Not just what they can do, but how little it seems to cost them to do it." I asked him what he meant, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes still fixed on the display. "A soldier who fears death hesitates," he said. "A soldier who has already made peace with it does not. What you watched tonight was not confidence, it was certainty, and certainty like that is not something most species are capable of carrying without it changing them into something the rest of us do not fully understand." He paused. "That is why the humans keep them separate from their regular forces, not because they are dangerous to us, because of what carrying that kind of certainty costs the people who carry it." I did not have a response to that. I only watched the display, where the last scattered fragments of the swarm were being methodically contained by the remaining Kryn forces, the war that had seemed unwinnable only days before now effectively over, decided in the end not by fleets or by numbers, but by 6 quiet figures who had walked into the heart of an impossible enemy and simply refused to be afraid of it. 3 days passed before I was asked to write the official after-action report, and by then the full scope of what had happened at the Kryn front had begun to settle across the coalition like a slow, quiet wave. The swarm's remaining fragments had been contained without further incident, its scattered units easily neutralized once the central intelligence guiding them had been destroyed. The Kryn assembly, which only a week earlier had stood on the edge of complete collapse, was already beginning the long process of rebuilding, their surviving fleet returning to secure what remained of their territory. I sat at my console for a long time before I began writing, staring at a blank document, unsure of how to properly summarize what I had witnessed without it sounding like exaggeration, or worse, like propaganda designed to inflate the reputation of a species the rest of the galaxy was already beginning to regard with a kind of careful, uneasy respect. Every sentence I attempted felt inadequate, either too clinical to capture what I had actually seen, or too dramatic to be taken seriously by the officers who would eventually read it. Vashek found me still staring at that same blank document late in the evening, the station around us quieter now than it had been in weeks, the long crisis finally beginning to fade into something people could exhale about. He read over my shoulder for a moment, noting the empty page, and gave a small, understanding nod. "It is difficult to describe accurately," he said. "I have tried to explain it myself, more than once, to officers who were not there to see it firsthand. Words never seem to carry the weight of it properly." I asked him how he usually began, and he thought about it for a moment before answering. "I do not try to explain what they did," he said. "I try to explain what it revealed. The tactics matter less than what they tell us about the people using them." That advice stayed with me as I finally began writing, describing not just the sequence of events at the outpost and later at the central structure, but the strange, unsettling calm that had defined every stage of the operation, the complete absence of hesitation, fear, or even satisfaction in victory. I wrote about the redacted files, the quiet arrival, the single tactical question that had replaced every formal greeting I had prepared. I wrote about watching 6 people dismantle a threat that had broken 3 coalition fleets, and about the eerie stillness of the command bunker in the aftermath, when the swarm's presence had simply ceased to exist. I was still finishing the report when word came that the human unit was preparing to depart, their mission complete, their transport already scheduled for departure within the hour. I left my console immediately, making my way toward the docking bay where I had first watched them arrive, feeling an unexpected urge to see them off, to understand, if only a little more, what I had witnessed over the past several days. The docking bay was quieter than it had been during their arrival, most of the earlier crowd of curious officers already dispersed back to their regular duties now that the crisis had passed. Nora stood near the boarding ramp of the transport, speaking quietly with two members of her unit, her expression as calm and composed as it had been from the very first moment I met her. She noticed me approaching and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, pausing her conversation to allow me to speak. I found myself struggling for words, uncertain how to properly express everything I had witnessed, everything I now understood about the cost of what her unit had done. "I wanted to thank you," I said finally, the words feeling small against the weight of what they were meant to carry. "For the assembly, for all of it." She studied me for a moment, and something in her expression softened slightly, a brief crack in the calm efficiency she had maintained throughout the entire operation. "The assembly would have done the same for us, if the situation had been reversed," she said. "That is what the coalition is supposed to mean." I asked her hesitantly about the file I had read on the first day, the long black bar where a service history should have been, the voluntary reactivation notation with no further explanation attached. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, what that meant and whether it was something she was permitted to discuss. She was quiet for a long moment, glancing toward her unit as they finished loading equipment onto the transport, before answering. "Every soldier my government sends into a coalition conflict follows a chain of command, files reports, receives recognition when the mission is done," she said. "That is how it should work, and for most of our forces, that is exactly how it does work." She paused. "But some situations require something different. Not because the mission is more important, but because the methods required to succeed are not ones a government can openly stand behind, even when they are necessary. When that happens, they do not send soldiers. They send people who volunteered, a long time ago, to be activated only when every other option had already failed." I asked her what happened to those people afterward, once the mission was complete, whether they returned to ordinary lives the way other soldiers did. She considered the question carefully before answering, and when she finally spoke, there was something quieter in her voice, something that felt more honest than anything she had said since her arrival. "Some of us try to," she said. "It is not always easy. You cannot walk into something like this and walk back out of it exactly the way you were before. That is part of the arrangement, I think, part of what it costs." She looked at me directly then, her eyes steady but not unkind. "You asked for soldiers. Soldiers follow orders, and when the mission ends, they go home to parades and to lives that continue more or less the way they left them. We are what is left when the orders run out, when following them stops being enough to solve the problem. That is a different kind of service, and it asks a different kind of price." I did not know how to respond to that, and for a long moment we simply stood there in silence, the quiet hum of the docking bay filling the space between us. Behind her, the rest of her unit finished loading the transport and began boarding without a word, the same quiet efficiency they had shown from the very beginning, already moving on to whatever came next, wherever that might be. Nora extended her hand toward me before turning to leave, and I shook it, feeling the same steady calm in her grip that I had seen in every action she had taken since arriving. "Take care of the assembly," she said. "They fought hard to keep what they have. That is worth protecting." Then she turned and walked up the boarding ramp, disappearing into the transport without looking back, and within minutes the ship was pulling away from the station, departing as quietly and unremarkably as it had arrived. No fanfare, no ceremony, nothing to mark the fact that it carried 6 people who had just saved an entire species from extinction. I stood in the docking bay for a long time after they left, watching the empty space where the transport had been, turning over everything Nora had said in my mind. Cyril found me there eventually, standing quietly beside me as we watched the stars beyond the viewport, the same stars that had carried that ship away into whatever mission or quiet life waited for its crew next. "You understand it now," she said, "why the galaxy speaks carefully around what humanity keeps in reserve." I told her I thought I did, though a part of me suspected I would spend a long time still trying to fully process everything I had witnessed over the past several days. The swarm that had threatened to erase the Kryn assembly from existence had been stopped, not by the overwhelming might of a coalition fleet, but by 6 quiet people who carried no visible fear, no hesitation, and no desire for recognition, people whose own government kept them separate from the ordinary heroes celebrated in official records, not because they were feared, but because of what it had cost them to become what the situation required. My after-action report was filed the following day, and within weeks, portions of it had circulated quietly through coalition command channels, shaping the careful, respectful tone that would come to define how allied species spoke about Earth's deployment capabilities from that point forward. The galaxy had asked humanity for soldiers, expecting, at best, a reliable and disciplined fighting force to stand alongside the rest of the coalition. What humanity had sent instead was something else entirely, something most species did not fully understand until they saw it in action, something that arrived without ceremony, worked without hesitation, and disappeared again just as quietly once its purpose was fulfilled. I never learned exactly where Nora Callahan and her unit went after leaving our station, what quiet life or quiet mission awaited them next, but I never forgot the words she left me with in that docking bay, words that eventually found their way into briefings across the coalition, a simple, steady explanation for why the rest of the galaxy had learned, through hard experience, to be careful about what it asked humanity to send. "You ask for soldiers. We are what is left when the orders run out." And somewhere out among the stars, quietly, without fanfare, that was exactly what they remained, ready for whatever request came next, waiting in the dark for the moment when ordinary solutions were no longer enough.